So I think upcycle fashion really is the only way forward for using what we're currently chucking into landfill and what is currently ending up in the Atacama Desert and setting alight, what is currently being washed up on the shores of Ghana and polluting their oceans. Upcycling is the only response to this.
Hi, Bel. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really grateful to have you here. So you've had quite a career from a fashion editor to an activist. I was wondering if you could just tell us a little bit about that career path and how it's played a role in your relationship with fashion.
So my name is Bel Jacobs. I'm a former fashion editor turned writer, speaker and campaigner for climate justice, for animal rights and for alternative systems in fashion. And while they all sound really, really different, the longer I've worked in this area, the more I see them really as inextricably linked. The forces that are creating inequities and climate chaos are fundamentally the same. And it comes down to justice. It comes down to consumption levels of how we treat the planet, how we use the planet. I'm often asked to speak about my turning point from what was really essentially on paper just the best job in the world, working with incredible people, meeting incredible people, working with the fantastic creative explosion that is fashion. And then I always mention really Rana Plaza as the turning point, even though I will say that there was a lot of unease even before Rana Plaza took place. I had a lot of unease with the fashion industry because it was getting ridiculously huge and ridiculously fast. Rana Plaza, as many of your listeners will already know, is the garment factory that fell in 2013. It took with it 1,134 lives, most of whom were young women, most of whom knew that the building was going to fall at some point. And it fell that day, leaving a trail of destruction of lives, of lost incomes, of families who'd lost mothers and daughters and sisters. And I think the importance of keeping that central is for me very, very key. And of course, as I've said many, many times, it opened a whole can of worms about the fashion industry, where so many parties started to look at the impact of particularly new fashion and ask very, very serious questions about it. If it was not such a deadly industry in so many ways, it would actually be quite mentally stimulating to see how fashion works to create desire, to create a system where people feel they have to buy new, a system that is based on old colonial lines of exploitation, where we are asking poor people in the global south to make clothes for rich people in the global north, to look at issues of waste, to look at issues of animal exploitation, to look at issues of nature exploitation. In so many ways, it's kind of like, and this phrase has been used before, the poster child of the capitalist system. So, and the reason why that's so important is I don't believe that it would have been possible to have the climate disaster, the ecological disaster we've got now without capitalism. It would not be possible to have capitalism without consumerism, without calling people to buy more than they need outside of planetary boundaries. And there is no greater site of consumerism, I still feel, than fashion. And so when people, as I said to you, when I consider everything interlinked, that's it. It's exploitation. It's the disregarding of the needs of the other, whether that is other people, other animals, of the planet herself. It's all interlinked. And I know really I'm not the only person thinking like this, but there's not enough of us making these connections. It continues to frustrate me. But it is also why I continue working in fashion.
Why do you think everyone should care about fashion and the issues that are facing the industry today?
So, one of the reasons fashion matters, why it still matters, is we are all going to need clothing. We're always going to need clothing. But another reason why it matters is that it is such a fantastic way of communicating some of these issues. So, as I said before, fashion has been described as capitalism's poster child, by which I mean the way it sort of overproduces, the way it, like I said, drives desire, creates desire where there should be none, plays with the human psyche. What are all the forces that gather together to make a young woman suddenly decide she wants to wear a particular color or a particular skirt length? It's a complicated psychological industry that is propped up by the earth from which the fibers come from, by the animals from which the fibers are coming from, by the cultures that it destroys in order to get workers into those factories in the global south, by aesthetics, cultural systems that it destroys in order to get those workers into factories in the global south. And so where all the places that fashion is sort of most fucked up, are all the spaces that are most ripe for change. If we could change them, would say so much. I mean, sometimes people say, try and imagine a clothing system for the future. Okay, let's imagine a clothing system for the future where every fiber is cherished, where the land that the fiber comes from is cherished, where the farmer who works on the land that the fiber comes from is cherished. Imagine a clothing system which respects animal lives so much that it doesn't kill them to make clothes. Imagine a clothing system where every person who's made that cloth is valued for the work they do and the skills that they bring. Imagine a clothing system where you receive a piece of clothing and you honor it and you don't wear it 3 times and throw it into landfill. So all of the places where fashion fails most are areas that we need to work upon, and which, if we worked upon those areas, would actually, I think, reframe our entire relationship with absolutely everything. We started thinking like that about clothing. We'd start thinking like that about food. We'd start thinking like that about fridges. It's, the potential is phenomenal. And fashion has this glamour to it. Can you imagine a fashion shoot where, these incredibly skilled artists, the photographers, the makeup, they actually just went, okay, we're not here to sell. We're here to promote life, But it's a really, really tricky industry to shift. It prides itself on innovation, and actually it's truly one of the conservative industries out there, I think, because it's actually quite slow to change, really change. It's great on changing the superficial, not so great on changing everything else. The other thing I would say about new clothing systems, that clothing system that I just described to you, where we value the farmer and the earth and the maker, they already exist in indigenous cultures in the global south. And I think this is such a time of rebalancing, of re-looking at those others and saying, maybe we're not the greatest, maybe the way they consume, the way they produce clothing is better. So fashion matters, but not in the way it used to matter. And that's something that will be very difficult for people to get their head around.
Yeah, you've touched on something really interesting there, I think, that fashion matters, but not in the way that it used to matter. And something that we've always found really interesting is times when fashion is used as a vehicle for political statements. So do you think that fashion can be political? And if so, what impacts can it have today?
Yes, of course. Everything can be political now. Everything is political now. It's gone way beyond, however, putting a slogan on a t-shirt and wearing that. I think fashion has to be political in its processes, in the decisions that we make, in its production. I think the most daring political action that a fashion brand can take right now is to question its own existence and then collapse itself if it feels that its skills are better used elsewhere. It's a really interesting, someone recently asked me my top 5 tips for fashion, and that was one of them. Be prepared to shut down. I can't emphasize what a dangerous place we're in. But fashion can use its platforms, yes. Fashion can use its fashion shows, its advertising campaigns, its designers can speak out a little bit more boldly, surely, and speak on behalf of the planet and people and animals. Will they? Probably not, because they're held in place by the same capitalist systems that other industries are being held in. One of the things that was really interesting is when I joined Extinction Rebellion Fashion Action, you were there, and we organized that funeral march in front of the British Fashion Council, that London Fashion Week. And it felt very moving. But what was even more moving was that after that funeral, people were coming up to us from within the industry and saying, thank you, because you've said what we've been feeling all along. And if you keep pushing the agenda, if you keep saying this system has to end, then we can keep pushing a bit harder from our side. But what I also realized is that no matter how much they wanted to change things, they actually couldn't. And so there were designers going, our hands are tied, you know. So yes, it can be political. Will a brand have enough courage to take that step? I don't know yet. And I don't know a lot of brands producing new clothing who are actually ever going to be in a space where they argue for their own collapse. That's a big ask. But we are also in a time when I think where the extreme weather events are going to start affecting supply chains. And I think the global fashion system is going to be faced with enormous physical challenges. So not cultural, not ideological, physical challenges. Talked to a small brand who works with women's cooperative in parts of the global south, and she asked, in order to upscale their skills and make sure that they were receiving an income, and she asked one group to weave some picnic baskets, which they did, but then the monsoon rains came and washed away their picnic baskets. So the women's cooperative said, can we have a bit more time or so? We'll weave some more. And so they painstakingly wove more, and then COVID hit and they couldn't ship them anyway. And that is just a tiny, tiny example of what I think we're going to start seeing across the world with supply chains, not simply of fashion, but food and energy and white goods and medicines. You know, it's so odd talking about this because I almost don't believe it, because I can see out my window a cool summer day and there are people going to cafes. It's almost surreal. But I would love it if fashion and the people involved in it, who are creative and kind and compassionate people, just went, we need to stand up now.
My next question is more focused on the fashion activism movement. What do you think the limitations are of the mainstream fashion activism at the moment? And how can we try to genuinely politicize fashion and not just make it a trend?
Yeah, so that is a really, really interesting question. And I think, and definitely since the climate, the presence of the youth voice in climate activism has come to the fore, what do we get? We're getting more of more influencer type spokespeople, and I find that quite deeply uncomfortable because many of them use the tropes of traditional social media influencing to talk about very, very difficult issues. And I have to say, I find it really uncomfortable sometimes, particularly with young women who will use their aesthetics to create almost personalities of themselves, and suddenly we're in a very familiar landscape, but it is being used for a good thing on the face of it. Yeah. And one of the reasons I'm cautious about that is we know that some of those old visual tropes come laden with sort of quite misogynistic. I don't know. It's very, very complex. It makes me feel twitchy. But there's another part of me that's like, I don't care how the message gets out there now. It needs to get out there. And so I'm really trying not to be critical now. I just want all voices out there in any way that they can be out there. But this idea of, climate activism, God, yes, of course, you're just reminding me when a whole load of climate activists turned up in the Stella McCartney campaign. And I remember just how weird that was to me. And I think it was the beginning of my ideas that you can't speak against the fashion industry and then appear in an advertising campaign for the fashion industry. It's just like, but I will say this about that time. We're in a transition, okay? And transitions are messy. And we've got some old value systems coming up and hitting new value systems, and everything seems a bit crazy and inconsistent. But at least we're kind of moving in the right direction. But I just remember that as this mad moment. I just didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to think. But early and also in those days, I remember a young woman coming up to me, and she was obviously very affected by some of the climate information that I delivered. She said, how do we make sure, this was about 4 years ago, how do we make sure that climate change is not a trend? How do we make sure that sustainability is not a trend? And I looked at her and I went, the weather will take care of that. And even then, I don't think I understood the full weight of what I was saying. But it seems to me increasingly that it will be incredibly uncomfortable to watch a fashion show and know that people are dying of starvation, to look at another ad campaign and know that, you know, there's wildfires across this area. I think it will be just so jarring. It is jarring to me now when I open up a fashion magazine, which I still have to sometimes for work, and I see all those old values and, you know, trends coming back and people not asking why, you know, or what is the best raincoat to wear this autumn. All those kind of stories seem so irrelevant to me. I absolutely can't understand how someone is putting together the content for those pages and not feeling utterly bizarre. So I think the weather will take care of it. But while I say that, I will also reiterate what I said before. We need all voices, all methods, all means to wake every different method that we use within climate activism and animal activism and fashion activism speaks to another market, speaks to another audience. So, and we need all that full range of action now, whether it's just using the influencer tropes to full on gluing yourself to a shop window. We need all of those. And when you then look at all of them, actually they're part of the big uprising that we're seeing. Every one of them has a space now. Every one of them is about building the new world that we need to see going forward. It's the resistance. They're all part of the resistance, yeah? And some of them are just using the old language, and some of them are being incredibly brave, like Just Stop Oil, and doing what needs to be done. But we're all part of the resistance.
Yeah, I completely agree with you there. We have all the power and we all need to contribute in one way or another that we can. So for those people who want to start getting involved but don't really know where to look, what would you say they can do?
So I think in terms of what people can do next, I think the first thing to do is look at where you work. And if you are working in an industry that's contributing to the problem, try and step away if you can, seriously, and tell them why you're stepping away. We can't give any more power and man hours and energy to toxic industries. I often say to people, reconnect with nature, not in an airy-fairy way, but really go and find groups that allow you to get your hands in the soil. We're losing so much. Now is the time to learn to love it, really love it, and engage with it and understand its processes. Buy less. Question why you, every purchase you make, ask yourself why you're really doing it. Don't buy new where you can. And in fashion, definitely don't buy new. unless it's really urgent. Find a community. There are a lot of people. When I talked about the resistance before, I run a climate centre, and I've been staggered by the number of like-minded groups just within my local area, and all of them need help, and all of them are important in this fight against a collapsing climate. And the other thing I would say is, now, in a more visionary way, dream about the future you want to see, something that you'd like to see change, and then try and bring it to life in a very concrete way. I'll give you an example of a man who just wanted to see more gardens on his street. So he took over a small parking space, he put out potted plants, he put out a table and chairs and lovely drinks, and he made it real for a time. And his neighbors came and sat with him, and they talked, and there was a garden on his street for 4 hours. And yet, even though that sounds really small, it's just a replacing of the old world with a good world. Just for 4 hours, there's this moment of beauty and community. And look up Transition Towns, which was created by a man called Rob Hopkins, who's doing incredible work envisioning new futures now. And think about how you can make them come to life in your street and in your community, within your family. Because that's really important in making the change that we need to see. But weirdly, the most fundamental change that I think that anyone can make is really veganism. For me, veganism, so I use the V word, and I know that a lot of people are going to stand back from this, but veganism is incredible, because what it does is 3 times a day, what you're saying is you're saying no to the ecological destruction perpetrated by animal agriculture. You're saying no to the really egregious suffering of billions of animals every year. You're saying no to human exploitation of those animals. You're saying no to climate change, which is animal agriculture has such a massive impact. And you are resisting 3 times a day really detrimental systems. And it's hard to begin with. You're making an effort to put forward a more positive future for the planet with veganism. And I'll often say it's not easy at the beginning, but just get the right amount of knowledge, do the research, find out what the animals endure, and then it becomes easy, and it becomes necessary, and it becomes important. And it is the ultimate act of resistance now. That's the system. That's the beginning of the system change we need to see, is when we step back from that kind of exploitation.
Okay, there's a lot of great suggestions there. And if anyone does want to get involved with the Islington Climate Centre, we will put a link to that in the comments below so you can have a look. And my final question would be, what do you think about upcycled fashion, and what role do you think it can play in helping to make fashion more sustainable?
Yeah. So I think upcycled fashion really is the only way forward for using what we're currently chucking into landfill, and what is currently ending up in the Atacama Desert and setting alight, what is currently being washed up on the shores of Ghana and polluting their oceans. Upcycling is the only response to this. We have to make use of what we've already got. If you just look at the sheer amount of fibers and water and man hours that goes into even the single cotton t-shirt, it is absolutely insane that we're throwing this away. And that is even before you factor in the fact that so many of 66% of the clothing we make today is polyester. So if you're burning that or chucking that in landfill, it's not going anywhere fast. But the wonderful thing about upcycling, I think, and using what we've got already, is that it unleashes this whole new creativity, this new way of thinking about clothes, this new way of putting clothes together, of the designer asking themselves what works, how can I do this effectively, can I communicate how important these items of clothing are before I start remodeling them. So upcycling is key. It's something I'd like to see every fashion brand engage in much more dynamically. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you, Bel. We'll see everyone else in the next one, where we'll be talking about the psychology of fashion with the psychologist Carolyn Mayer.